The torn pieces of her American passport fell through her fingers like confetti at a funeral. Imani Thornton stood frozen at the TSA checkpoint while a white officer screamed in her face. He called her a fraud. A criminal. He had no idea that in 7 days, she would become CEO of the very airline whose planes surrounded them. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from today. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their skin color. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that Monday morning and discover how one woman's worst nightmare became her greatest triumph. The alarm on Imani Thornton's phone buzzed at exactly 4:30 in the morning, piercing through the quiet darkness of her modest 2-bedroom apartment in Midtown Atlanta. She reached over and silenced it, then lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling as the weight of what this day meant slowly settled over her like a heavy blanket. Today was supposed to be simple. Catch a flight to New York. Attend a press conference. Become the first black female CEO of a major American airline. Simple. Except nothing in Imani's 32 years of life had ever been simple. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal the Atlanta skyline just beginning to glow with the first hints of dawn. Her apartment was nothing special. Clean white walls, minimal furniture, a small kitchen that she rarely used because she was always traveling. On one wall hung her MBA diploma from Harvard Business School, the frame slightly crooked because she had never gotten around to fixing it. Next to it was a photograph that meant more to her than any degree ever could. Her father, Raymond Thornton, stood proudly in his General Motors uniform, his arm around a teenage Imani, both of them grinning at the camera outside the Detroit assembly plant where he had worked for 28 years. Imani touched the photograph gently, her fingers tracing the outline of her father's face. He had been gone for 13 years now, taken by lung cancer that spread through his body like wildfire because they couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved him. He died without health insurance, without savings, without ever seeing his daughter become anything more than a girl with big dreams and empty pockets. But he died believing in her. That was what mattered. She walked to her closet and deliberately chose her most unassuming outfit. A simple white blouse. Black jeans. Comfortable flats. No jewelry except for the small gold cross her mother had given her for her 18th birthday. She wanted to arrive in New York without being recognized, without the fanfare that would come later. The press conference wasn't until 3 in the afternoon. She had time to gather herself, to prepare mentally for the moment when the whole world would learn her name. As she dressed, Imani thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. At 17 years old, she had started working as a part-time baggage handler at Detroit Metro Airport, loading suitcases onto planes while her classmates went to parties and football games. Her father had just been laid off from GM after nearly 3 decades of loyal service, another casualty of corporate restructuring and broken promises. The family needed money, and Imani was determined to help. She remembered the weight of those bags, the ache in her shoulders after 8-hour shifts, the way some passengers would look right through her as if she didn't exist. She remembered working the overnight shift and then going straight to class, surviving on coffee and determination. She remembered the day her father came home from the doctor with the diagnosis, his face gray and his eyes filled with a fear she had never seen before. She remembered holding his hand in the hospital room, feeling the life drain out of him while machines beeped and nurses whispered and nobody could do anything to stop it. Raymond Thornton died on a Tuesday morning in March, when the snow was still falling outside and Imani had just turned 19. His last words to her were simple. "They will never see your worth, baby girl. But you will prove them all wrong." She had carried those words with her every single day since. Through college at Michigan State, where she graduated with a 3.9 GPA while working 30 hours a week. Through her acceptance into Harvard Business School, where she was one of only a handful of black women in her class. Through her return to the airline industry, this time as a management trainee at Atlantic Airways. 10 years she had climbed the corporate ladder, one rung at a time. Gate agent. Station manager. Regional director. Vice President of Operations. Chief Operating Officer. And now, CEO. The board had voted unanimously 3 months ago, choosing her from a pool of 12 candidates that included former airline executives, Wall Street bankers, and industry veterans with decades more experience. They chose her because she understood the business from the ground up. They chose her because she had a vision for the future. They chose her because she was simply the best person for the job. At 5:15, Imani grabbed her small carry-on suitcase and her laptop bag, taking one last look around her apartment before heading out the door. She didn't call for a company car. She didn't want any special treatment. She ordered an Uber like any other traveler and waited outside her building as the Atlanta morning slowly came to life around her. In the car, she pulled out her phone and sent a text message to Theodore Kingston, the chairman of Atlantic Airways board of directors. On my way to ATL Airport. We'll see you in NYC this afternoon. His reply came almost instantly, despite the early hour. The press conference is set for 3 p.m. America is about to meet its newest aviation pioneer. Safe travels, Imani. She smiled and put her phone away, watching the city pass by outside the window. She had no idea that in less than an hour, her entire world would be turned upside down. Meanwhile, at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Gerald Whitmore was starting his shift at Checkpoint B of Terminal South. At 54 years old, Gerald had been with the Transportation Security Administration for 22 years, longer than most of his colleagues had been alive. He wore his uniform with military precision, every crease sharp, every button polished. His silver hair was cut short in the style he had maintained since his days in the Army Reserve, and his face carried the permanent scowl of a man who believed the world was constantly trying to pull something over on him. Gerald considered himself a patriot. A guardian. The last line of defense between America and the threats that sought to destroy it. He took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously, and he had developed what he called an instinct for spotting trouble. His colleagues had another word for it. They called him the gatekeeper, and not as a compliment. Gerald's instinct seemed to activate most frequently around passengers who didn't look like him. Passengers with darker skin. Passengers with foreign accents. Passengers who wore headscarves or spoke languages he didn't understand. The morning briefing was the same as always. The supervisor droned on about protocol and procedure, reminding everyone about the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity regardless of their background. Gerald listened with barely concealed contempt, his arms crossed over his chest. When the supervisor mentioned the department's commitment to eliminating racial profiling, Gerald leaned over to the white officer next to him and whispered, "Political correctness is killing this country." Derek Simmons, a young black TSA officer standing nearby, heard every word. He felt his jaw tighten but said nothing. He had a wife and 2 kids at home, a mortgage payment due next week, and no desire to make an enemy of the senior officer on his shift. He had seen what happened to people who crossed Gerald Whitmore. Complaints disappeared. Schedules became suddenly unfavorable. Life became difficult in 100 small ways that were impossible to prove and impossible to endure. The briefing ended and Gerald took his position at the main screening lane, the busiest checkpoint in the busiest airport in the world. It was a Monday morning, which meant thousands of business travelers rushing to catch early flights, all of them impatient and stressed and convinced that their time was more valuable than anyone else's. Gerald surveyed the growing crowd with narrowed eyes, already looking for someone who didn't belong. By 5:45, Hartsfield-Jackson was buzzing with activity. The airport was a city unto itself, a sprawling complex of terminals and concourses and runways that processed more passengers than any other airport on the planet. It was also a symbol of Atlanta itself, a city that had risen from the ashes of the Civil War to become the capital of the New South, the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, the home of Martin Luther King Jr. Somewhere in that history was a promise of equality that had never quite been fulfilled. Imani's Uber pulled up to the departure level of Terminal South at exactly 6 o'clock. She thanked the driver, grabbed her bags, and walked through the automatic doors into the chaos of the morning rush. She was just another traveler in a sea of travelers, anonymous and unremarkable, exactly the way she wanted it. She had no idea that within the hour, every camera in this airport would be focused on her face. Imani made her way through the terminal with practiced efficiency, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her as she navigated around slower travelers and crying children. She had done this thousands of times over the past 15 years, first as an employee and later as an executive, and she knew every shortcut and every bottleneck in this airport. She headed straight for Checkpoint B, where the TSA pre-check line would get her through security in minutes rather than the hour it sometimes took in the regular lanes. The pre-check line was already building when she arrived at 6:05, but it was moving steadily. Imani took her place behind a middle-aged white woman in a designer suit who was talking loudly into her phone about a deal that absolutely had to close today. The woman glanced back at Imani, and her eyes performed that familiar dance that Imani had come to know so well over the years. A quick up and down assessment. A slight narrowing of the eyes. A subtle shift away, as if proximity to a black woman in jeans might somehow contaminate her expensive outfit. Imani ignored it. She had learned long ago that reacting to every small slight would consume her entire existence, leaving no room for anything else. She pulled out her phone and began reviewing her notes for the press conference, scrolling through the speech that the communications team had prepared. The words felt right, but she planned to add a personal touch, something about her father and what this moment would have meant to him. She was still editing when she reached the front of the line. The first TSA officer was a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She scanned Imani's boarding pass, checked her ID, and nodded approvingly. "New York, nice. Have a good flight." Imani thanked her and moved forward to the screening area, placing her laptop in a separate bin, removing her flats, loading her carry-on onto the conveyor belt. She was about to walk through the body scanner when a voice stopped her cold. "Hold it right there." Gerald Whitmore had spotted Imani the moment she entered his line of sight. A young black woman in casual clothes, standing in the pre-check line as if she belonged there. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, confident and unhurried, like someone who had never been questioned in her life. Maybe it was the expensive laptop she pulled from her bag, which didn't match the simplicity of her outfit. Or maybe it was simply the color of her skin in a space that Gerald had unconsciously decided belonged to a certain type of person. He raised his hand and signaled to the officer at the scanner. "Random additional screening. This one." Imani looked up, surprised but not alarmed. This wasn't the first time she had been pulled aside for extra screening, though it happened less frequently now that she traveled in business class with TSA pre-check status. She assumed it was just bad luck, a random selection from the computer system designed to keep the process unpredictable. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked politely. Gerald didn't answer. He simply pointed toward a roped-off area to the side, where passengers flagged for additional screening were taken for more thorough inspection. "Step over here, ma'am." Imani gathered her belongings from the conveyor belt and followed his direction, her mind already calculating how much time this would cost her. She still had almost 2 hours before boarding, plenty of buffer room. She wasn't worried. She should have been. The secondary screening area was a small space defined by portable barriers, visible to everyone passing through the main checkpoint but separated enough to feel isolating. Gerald positioned himself directly in front of Imani, his bulk blocking her view of the line she had just left. 2 other officers flanked him, both white men in their 30s who seemed content to follow their senior colleague's lead. "Open your bag," Gerald commanded. Imani complied, unzipping her carry-on and stepping back to give him access. Inside was exactly what you would expect from a business traveler. 2 suits, carefully folded. A makeup bag. A phone charger. A folder of documents related to the press conference. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would warrant the level of scrutiny Gerald was about to apply. He dug through her belongings with deliberate roughness, unfolding her clothes and dropping them in a heap, opening her makeup bag and examining each item as if it might be a weapon in disguise. When he reached her underwear, he held up a pair of lace panties and made a show of inspecting them, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Imani felt heat rising in her cheeks. Is that really necessary? Gerald looked at her with cold eyes. I decide what's necessary. He continued his search, finding nothing because there was nothing to find. But instead of letting her go, he picked up her passport and began examining it with exaggerated suspicion. He turned it over in his hands, held it up to the light, squinted at the photo as if trying to spot a forgery that didn't exist. Where are you traveling to? He asked. New York. For business. What kind of business does someone like you have in New York? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Someone like you. The words were careful enough to provide deniability but clear enough to convey exactly what he meant. Imani kept her voice steady. I work in the aviation industry. Gerald's laugh was a short, sharp bark that drew attention from nearby passengers. Aviation industry? Doing what? Cleaning airplanes. For a moment, Imani was stunned into silence. She had faced discrimination before, subtle and not so subtle, but the brazenness of his contempt caught her off guard. She was standing in an airport that served as a hub for the airline she was about to lead, being mocked by a government employee who assumed that a black woman in jeans couldn't possibly be anything other than a janitor. I don't think my specific job duties are relevant to this screening, she said carefully. Gerald stepped closer, invading her personal space. Everything is relevant when I'm protecting this country. Now answer the question. What exactly do you do in aviation? Derek Simmons was watching from his position near the body scanners. He had seen Gerald do this before, dozens of times. The unnecessary stops. The invasive questions. The subtle humiliation disguised as security. He knew he should say something, should intervene, should report what he was witnessing. But he also knew what would happen if he did. Gerald had been doing this for 22 years. Derek had been here for 3. Who would they believe? Imani met Gerald's gaze without flinching. I'm an executive. And I don't believe I'm required to explain my job description to pass through airport security. Something shifted in Gerald's expression. The mockery gave way to anger, the anger of a small man who had been challenged by someone he considered beneath him. He held up her passport, pointing at the stamps from countries around the world. London. Paris. Tokyo. Dubai. Singapore. A lot of international travel for what did you say you were? An executive? He pronounced the word with dripping sarcasm. You know, I've been doing this job for a long time. And I've learned to spot people who don't belong. Don't belong where exactly? Imani asked quietly. Gerald smiled, a cold and cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. Don't play games with me. This passport looks suspicious. I need to verify it. Suspicious how? It's a valid United States passport, issued by the Department of State. Don't tell me how to do my job. Gerald's voice was rising now, loud enough to attract stares from passengers in the main line. I ask the questions here. You answer. That's how this works. Imani looked at her watch. She still had time, but this was quickly becoming something more than an inconvenience. This was becoming an incident. Sir, I have a flight to catch. If there's no actual problem with my passport, I would like to proceed. Gerald leaned in close, so close that she could smell the coffee on his breath. You'll proceed when I say you can proceed. His voice dropped to a whisper meant only for her ears. I've seen hundreds of you people trying to sneak through with fake documents. You're not fooling me. Imani felt as if she had been slapped. Excuse me. You people. You heard me. Gerald straightened up, his voice returning to normal volume. Now sit down and wait while I call my supervisor. I want your badge number, Imani said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. And I want to speak to your supervisor immediately. Gerald laughed again. Oh, you're one of those. Always playing the victim. Always crying racism when someone treats you like everybody else. You are not treating me like everybody else. You are treating me like a criminal because of the color of my skin. See, there it is. The race card. Right on schedule. A few feet away, Miriam Goldstein had stopped to watch the confrontation. She was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Miami who was flying to Atlanta to visit her grandchildren. She had lived through enough history to recognize injustice when she saw it, and what she was witnessing now made her blood run cold. Without thinking, she pulled out her phone and began recording. Gerald grabbed his radio and called for backup, his voice crackling through the device with barely contained satisfaction. I need additional officers at secondary screening, checkpoint B, possible fraudulent document. The words echoed through the checkpoint, causing heads to turn and conversations to stop. Possible fraudulent document. In the language of airport security, those words carried serious weight. They suggested criminality. Deception. Danger. They transformed Imani from a traveler into a suspect in the eyes of everyone who heard them. Within minutes, 2 more TSA officers arrived, both white men who positioned themselves on either side of Gerald like soldiers flanking their general. Imani found herself surrounded, boxed in by blue uniforms and hostile stares. The passengers waiting in the regular security line had stopped moving forward, too fascinated by the unfolding drama to remember their own flights. Phones were appearing everywhere, held up by travelers who sensed they were witnessing something that would later go viral. Imani felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. She had dealt with racism before, had navigated the minefields of corporate America as a black woman for 15 years, had learned to pick her battles and maintain her composure in situations that would have broken lesser people. But this was different. This was public. This was being recorded. This was going to follow her no matter what happened next. Sir, she said, addressing all 3 officers but looking directly at Gerald. I am a United States citizen. This is my valid passport. I demand to know why I am being detained. Gerald shook his head slowly, a teacher disappointed in a troublesome student. Nobody's detaining you. We're just doing our job. Protecting this country from threats. He let the word hang in the air, its meaning unmistakable. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that something about this situation wasn't right. But he said nothing. None of them said anything. They simply stood there, a wall of authority and implicit accusation, while Imani stood alone on the other side. Gerald turned to his colleagues, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Look at this. Claims to work in aviation. But dressed like she's going to a yard sale. The 2 officers laughed, the nervous laughter of men who weren't sure if the joke was funny but knew better than to challenge the person telling it. Several passengers in line looked away, embarrassed to be witnessing such obvious cruelty but unwilling to intervene on behalf of a stranger. A few others nodded along with Gerald, their own prejudices validated by the scene unfolding before them. Imani felt something break inside her, some carefully maintained wall that she had built over years of swallowing insults and rising above. Her voice came out harder than she intended. My attire is not relevant to the validity of my travel documents. And making comments about my appearance is unprofessional at best and discriminatory at worst. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Did you just call me discriminatory? I'm describing your behavior. You have singled me out for additional screening without cause. You have made comments about my race and my clothing. You have implied that I am attempting to commit fraud based on nothing but your personal assumptions. Where did you learn to talk like that? Gerald sneered. Did you get a discount education somewhere? Harvard Business School, Imani shot back. Not that it's any of your business. The words clearly caught Gerald off guard. His smirk faltered for just a moment before returning in force. Harvard. Right. And I'm the President of the United States. He turned to his colleagues, inviting them to share in his disbelief. She says she went to Harvard. Next she'll be telling us she's running a Fortune 500 company. The irony of his words would become apparent soon enough, but in that moment, they served only to deepen Imani's humiliation. She was standing in the middle of a crowded airport, being mocked by a government employee for daring to suggest that she might be educated, might be accomplished, might be something more than the stereotype he had already decided she was. A white businessman in the security line called out impatiently. "Can you hurry this up? Some of us have flights to catch." Gerald shouted back without turning around. "Sir, this is a security matter. Please be patient." Derek Simmons stood frozen at his post, watching the scene with mounting horror. His hands were clenched at his sides, and he could feel sweat forming on his palms despite the aggressive air conditioning. He knew what he was witnessing was wrong. He knew that Gerald was abusing his authority, that this woman had done nothing to deserve this treatment, that every second of inaction made him complicit in her humiliation. But still he didn't move. Still he didn't speak. The mortgage. The kids. The fear. Gerald picked up Imani's passport again, examining it with theatrical suspicion. He held it up to the fluorescent lights, squinting at the seal as if searching for imperfections that existed only in his imagination. He flipped through the pages, studying each stamp as if it were evidence of some elaborate criminal conspiracy. "This seal doesn't look right," he announced loudly. "The photo seems altered." "That passport was issued by the United States Department of State," Imani said, fighting to keep her voice level. "It is completely authentic. If you have doubts, scan it through your system. Run it through whatever database you want. You will see that it's valid." Gerald shook his head. "I don't need a machine to tell me what my eyes can see. Your eyes are showing you what you want to see. Not what's actually there." The accusation hung in the air between them. Gerald's face flushed red, the color of a man whose authority had been challenged by someone he considered worthless. He stepped forward until he was inches from Imani's face, close enough that she could see the broken capillaries in his nose and the hatred swimming in his pale eyes. "You know what we do with fraudulent documents?" he asked softly. Imani held her ground. "I know what you should do. You should verify them properly and then apologize for wasting my time." Gerald smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey, the smile of a man who was about to do something terrible and wanted her to know it. And then, before Imani could react, before anyone could stop him, Gerald grabbed her passport with both hands and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the noise of the checkpoint like a gunshot. Every conversation stopped. Every movement ceased. Hundreds of people stood frozen, watching as Gerald Whitmore continued to tear the passport into smaller and smaller pieces, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction. "There," he said, throwing the confetti of destroyed identity at Imani's chest. The pieces clung to her white blouse, caught in her hair, fluttered to the floor at her feet. "Now you can go back to wherever you came from." Imani couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only stand there, watching the fragments of her passport drift down around her like snow, each piece carrying a stamp from a country she had visited, a memory of who she was and what she had accomplished. Her photo stared up at her from the floor, torn in half but still recognizable, a black woman who had dared to dream beyond the boundaries others had set for her. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him that satisfaction. She would not break down in front of this man who had just committed what amounted to an assault on her identity, her citizenship, her very right to exist as an American. The checkpoint remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, sounds began to return. A woman's voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Oh my God! Did he just do that?" A man's voice, angry and incredulous. "That's completely out of line." Whispers spreading like wildfire through the terminal. Phone still recording, capturing everything. Miriam Goldstein's hands were shaking, but she kept her camera steady. She had witnessed many things in her 73 years, but she had never seen anything quite like this. She had never seen a government official so brazenly destroy a person's documents, so openly display his contempt for another human being based on nothing but the color of her skin. She thought about her granddaughter, half black, 7 years old, and wondered what world she would grow up in if people like Gerald Whitmore were allowed to act with impunity. Gerald seemed to finally realize that he had an audience. He looked around at the faces staring back at him, the phones pointed in his direction, the expressions of shock and disapproval and barely contained outrage. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across his features. Then he squared his shoulders and doubled down. "Nothing to see here," he shouted at the crowd. "This woman was attempting to travel with fraudulent documents. I did what any patriot would do." But the crowd wasn't buying it. They had seen everything. They had recorded everything. And in the age of social media, Gerald Whitmore had just made himself the villain in a story that would be viewed by millions before the day was over. Derek Simmons finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Gerald, maybe we should." Gerald spun around, his face contorted with rage. "Stay out of this, Derek. I've got it under control." But he didn't have anything under control. He had just lit a match in a room full of gasoline, and the explosion was about to begin. Imani slowly knelt down and began picking up the pieces of her passport, one fragment at a time. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were collecting sacred relics rather than scraps of destroyed paper. When she had gathered as many as she could find, she stood up and looked Gerald directly in the eye. "Evidence," she said quietly. "I'm collecting evidence." "Evidence for what?" Gerald laughed. "Your deportation hearing." Imani's expression didn't change. "No. Evidence for yours." Something shifted in Imani at that moment, a transformation invisible to everyone watching but seismic in its implications. She was no longer the victim of this encounter. She was no longer the black woman being humiliated by a racist TSA agent. She had become something else entirely, something Gerald Whitmore could never have anticipated. She had become the architect of his destruction. Imani closed her eyes and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the recycled airport air while the chaos swirled around her. In her mind, she heard her father's voice, the voice she had carried with her through every obstacle and every triumph for the past 13 years. "When they go low, you go high. But when they destroy, you rebuild stronger." Raymond Thornton had spoken those words to her when she was 14, after a teacher told her she wasn't smart enough for advanced classes, after a guidance counselor suggested she focus on vocational training instead of college, after a world full of people who looked at her black skin and saw limitations instead of possibilities. Her father had never let her accept those limitations. He had taught her to fight back, not with fists or anger, but with excellence. With success. With the undeniable truth of her accomplishments. When Imani opened her eyes again, the fear was gone. In its place was something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. Gerald Whitmore had made a terrible mistake. He just didn't know it yet. "You're threatening me?" Gerald demanded, his voice rising to match his growing unease. "You? A nobody with a fake passport?" Imani allowed herself a small smile. "I'm not threatening you, sir. I'm informing you of what's about to happen." She pulled out her phone, her movements calm and deliberate, and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Theodore Kingston. Chairman of the board. The man who had championed her promotion, who had fought for her against board members who thought the airline wasn't ready for a black female CEO, who had staked his own reputation on her success. She pressed call and waited. Gerald watched her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Who are you calling?" "Your lawyer. Good luck finding one who'll take your case. You have no proof of anything." Imani gestured toward the crowd, toward the dozens of phones still recording. "I think I have plenty of proof, Mr. Whitmore." Kingston answered on the second ring. "Imani? Is everything all right? You should be boarding by now." Imani put the phone on speaker, making sure her voice would carry. "Theodore. It's Imani. I'm at Hartsfield-Jackson. We have a situation." Gerald's expression changed at the sound of a male voice on the other end of the line. More specifically, it changed at the way Imani addressed the voice. "Theodore. Not Mr. Kingston. Not sir. Just Theodore, as if she were speaking to a friend. An equal. Kingston's voice crackled through the phone speaker. Imani? What's going on? You should be boarding now. A TSA supervisor just destroyed my passport. In front of hundreds of witnesses. Silence from the other end. The kind of silence that precedes a storm. He did what? Kingston's voice had dropped an octave, taking on the dangerous calm of a man who was about to make someone's life very difficult. Which airport? Which checkpoint? Hartsfield-Jackson. Checkpoint B, Terminal South. The supervisor's name is Gerald Whitmore. Stay right there. Do not move. I'm calling the TSA administrator directly. And then I'm calling our legal team. Kingston paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made Gerald take an involuntary step backward. This airport is about to learn who they just messed with. The call ended, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Gerald stared at Imani with new eyes, the confident contempt of moments ago giving way to something that looked almost like fear. Who was that? He demanded. Who were you talking to? Imani slipped her phone back into her pocket. My employer. And who exactly is your employer? The question hung in the air between them. Around the checkpoint, passengers had stopped even pretending to go about their business. Everyone was watching, waiting, sensing that something momentous was about to be revealed. Imani met Gerald's gaze without blinking. Atlantic Airways. Gerald's laugh was immediate but uncertain. Right. And what do you do there? Serve peanuts. Before Imani could respond, her phone began buzzing with a relentless stream of notifications. Emails from the VP of Legal. Text messages from the head of communications. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize but could guess the origins of. The machine was waking up. The cavalry was coming. She glanced at her screen long enough to read a text from the communications director. Just saw Twitter. Someone's posting video. We're monitoring. Stay calm. Legal team mobilizing. Gerald was watching her, watching the phone light up with message after message, watching her expression remain calm despite the chaos. His radio crackled to life, and the voice that came through made the color drain from his face. Whitmore, this is Deputy Director Cole. What the hell is going on at Checkpoint B? Gerald fumbled for the radio, nearly dropping it in his haste. Sir, I have a suspicious individual with fraudulent documents. I made a judgment call based on. Cole cut him off. Did you destroy a passenger's passport? Please tell me the reports are wrong. Sir, the passport was clearly fake. I did my job. Stay where you are. I'm coming down personally. Cole's voice was ice. And Whitmore? I strongly suggest you start praying. Derek Simmons leaned over to a fellow officer, his whisper carrying in the sudden quiet. I think Gerald just ended his career. The passengers around the checkpoint were buzzing with speculation. Imani could hear fragments of their conversations floating toward her like debris from an explosion. Did you hear her? She works for Atlantic Airways. She called someone named Theodore. Like she knows him personally. Look at how she's standing now. She doesn't look scared anymore. Who is she? That last question was asked by Miriam Goldstein, who had lowered her phone and approached Imani with gentle curiosity. Dear, are you okay? I recorded everything. That man should be in jail. Imani turned to the elderly woman, gratitude softening her features. Thank you, ma'am. Please keep that video safe. It's going to be very important. Who are you, really? Imani looked past Miriam to where Gerald stood frozen by his radio, his world visibly crumbling around him. Someone who's about to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Now I have a question for you. Do you believe that people like Gerald Whitmore should face consequences for their actions, or do you think he was just doing his job? Comment number 1 if you think he deserves to be fired. Comment number 2 if you think he deserves something more, something that sends a message to every authority figure who abuses their power. While you're thinking about that, hit that like button if you believe every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their skin color. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Because what happens next in this story will shock you. Gerald Whitmore thought he had destroyed a nobody. He was about to discover just how wrong he was. Harrison Cole arrived at checkpoint B like a thunderstorm rolling across the Georgia plain. At 48 years old, he was the deputy director of TSA for the Southeast region, one of the highest-ranking black officials in the entire administration. He had earned that position through 30 years of dedicated service, starting as a baggage screener at LaGuardia Airport and working his way up through every level of the organization. He knew what it was like to be looked at with suspicion, to be questioned and doubted and underestimated. He had fought against those prejudices his entire career, and he had zero tolerance for officers who perpetuated them. Cole strode through the checkpoint with the confidence of a man who owned every inch of space he occupied. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his expression carved from granite. Behind him trailed 2 assistants who were practically running to keep up with his long strides. Passengers parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, sensing instinctively that this was not a man to be delayed. Gerald saw him coming and straightened unconsciously, his military training kicking in despite the civilian context. Cole was his direct superior, the man who signed off on his performance reviews and approved his overtime requests. More importantly, Cole was black. And Gerald had just been caught on video tearing up a black woman's passport while calling her, "you people." Cole stopped directly in front of Gerald, close enough that their chests nearly touched. "Whitmore. My office. Now." Gerald's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Sir, I can explain everything. This woman was clearly traveling on fraudulent documents. I made a judgment call based on." I said now. Gerald started to move, then stopped when Cole raised a hand. "Wait. First, you're going to apologize to this woman." "Sir, she had a fake." Cole's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than a shout. "That fake passport was issued to Imani Thornton. I just got a call from the TSA administrator himself. You know who else called him? The chairman of Atlantic Airways. The chairman, Whitmore. Calling about one of their employees that you decided to harass and humiliate." Gerald's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked at Imani as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, and what he saw clearly terrified him. "I don't care who she claims to know," he finally managed. "I did my job. I followed my instincts. 22 years of experience." "Your job," Cole interrupted, "is to protect travelers. Not to destroy their documents based on the color of their skin." "I didn't. That's not what happened. I saw suspicious behavior. I made a call. That's what we're trained to do." Cole pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "I've been looking at your record, Whitmore. Do you know how many random screenings you've conducted in the past year?" Gerald said nothing. 87% of them were on passengers of color. 87%. Does that sound random to you? Still nothing. Cole turned to face Imani, and his entire demeanor changed. The hardness melted away, replaced by genuine remorse and something that looked almost like admiration. "Ms. Thornton, on behalf of the Transportation Security Administration, I am deeply sorry for what you've experienced here today. This behavior is unacceptable. It goes against everything we stand for as an organization." Imani nodded slowly, acknowledging his words without fully accepting them. "Deputy Director Cole, I appreciate your apology. Truly. But words alone cannot fix what happened here today. I understand. Tell me what you need. What can we do?" Imani looked past Cole to where Gerald stood, shoulders slumped, face pale, the picture of a man watching his life unravel. "You can start by making sure Mr. Whitmore never does this to anyone else." You can make sure that the next black traveler who walks through this checkpoint is treated with the same respect as everyone else. You can acknowledge that what happened here wasn't an isolated incident, wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a good man making a bad decision in a stressful moment. It was racism. Plain and simple. And it needs to be called exactly what it is. Gerald's head snapped up at the word racism, and his face contorted with defensive anger. This is ridiculous. I'm being punished for doing my job. Do you know how many times I've been right about suspicious passengers? Do you know how many potential threats I've intercepted? Cole raised an eyebrow. How many? What? How many threats have you intercepted, Gerald? In 22 years, how many actual terrorists have you caught? The silence that followed was answer enough. Cole continued, his voice cold. I'll tell you how many. 0. You've never caught a single actual threat. What you have done is harass hundreds of innocent people, people who had every right to be in this airport, people whose only crime was having skin that looked different from yours. Gerald's composure finally cracked. She could be a terrorist for all we know. Just because she has some connections, just because she knows somebody important, that doesn't mean. Imani stepped forward, cutting him off. I was born in Detroit General Hospital on March 15, 1993. I grew up on 7 Mile Road, in a house that my father bought with 30 years of factory wages. I buried him at Woodmere Cemetery when I was 19 years old, after he died from cancer because we couldn't afford the treatments that might have saved him. I have paid taxes in this country for 15 years. I have voted in every election since I turned 18. I am more American than your prejudice will ever allow you to see. Gerald stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Anyone can say that. Anyone can make up a story. But not everyone has the position to make sure people like you are held accountable. And what position is that? Gerald sneered, making one last desperate attempt to regain control. Secretary? Flight attendant? Before Cole could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened further. The video is on Twitter. It has 50,000 views already. Imani didn't seem surprised. Let me guess. It's trending. Yes. And CNN just reached out for comment. Gerald's face went from pale to ashen. Wait, what video? Who recorded? Cole gestured to the crowd around them, many of whom still had their phones raised. You destroyed a woman's passport in front of a crowd, Gerald. In the most surveilled building in the state of Georgia. What did you think would happen? Gerald spun toward the watching passengers, his voice rising to a shout. Who recorded? Delete it. All of you. This is a federal security area. You're not allowed to record in here. An older woman's voice cut through his protests with surprising strength. I recorded, Miriam Goldstein said, stepping forward with her phone clutched to her chest like a shield. And I've already uploaded it. You can't bully all of us, young man. Some of us remember what happens when good people stay silent. Gerald looked around wildly, realizing too late that he was surrounded. Not by allies, but by witnesses. Every face that met his gaze reflected some combination of disgust, disappointment, or barely contained rage. Even the officers who had backed him up minutes ago were edging away, creating distance between themselves and the disaster he had become. Cole's phone buzzed again. And again. And again. We need to move this somewhere private, he said. Ms. Thornton, would you be willing to? He was interrupted by the sound of commotion near the terminal entrance. 3 people in business attire were pushing through the crowd, flashing credentials at anyone who tried to stop them. Behind them, Imani could see the flash of news cameras gathering outside the security checkpoint. The cavalry had arrived. The 3 newcomers cut through the crowd like sharks through still water. Victoria Chen, Chief Legal Officer of Atlantic Airways, led the charge. At 35, she was one of the youngest CLOs in the industry, with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a win rate in court that had earned her the nickname, the Closer. Behind her came James Morrison, head of communications, already tapping away at his phone as he walked. Bringing up the rear was Marcus Webb, head of corporate security, a former FBI agent whose mere presence seemed to part crowds. Victoria reached Imani first, her eyes scanning quickly for any signs of physical injury. "Miss Thornton, are you physically unharmed?" "Yes," Imani replied. "But my passport is not." Victoria's gaze dropped to the torn fragment still clutched in Imani's hands, and her expression shifted from concern to something much more dangerous. "Perfect evidence." James Morrison looked up from his phone, his face grim. "The press is outside. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, local affiliates, everyone. The video has 2 million views now. It's the #1 trending topic on Twitter." Gerald Whitmore stood frozen, watching the new arrivals with growing horror. These were not airport officials or TSA supervisors. These were corporate executives in expensive suits, people who radiated power and authority, people who clearly knew the woman he had just humiliated. His voice came out thin and reedy. "Who are these people?" Victoria turned to face him, and Gerald took an involuntary step backward. There was something terrifying in her calm. "I'm Victoria Chen, Chief Legal Officer of Atlantic Airways." She paused, letting the title sink in. "And you, Mr. Whitmore, have just assaulted our incoming CEO." The words seemed to hit Gerald like physical blows. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Finally, a whisper. "CEO? What are you talking about?" James Morrison stepped forward, pulling up a document on his tablet and turning the screen to face Gerald. It was the press release that had been scheduled for release at 3 o'clock that afternoon, the announcement that would introduce Imani Thornton to the world as the new leader of Atlantic Airways. Her photo dominated the page, the same face that Gerald had been mocking and demeaning for the past hour, now presented beneath a headline that would change everything. Atlantic Airways announces Imani Thornton as new Chief Executive Officer. Gerald read the words 3 times, his lips moving silently as if trying to make them mean something different. This can't be real. She was wearing jeans. She didn't have a driver or security. She was in the regular pre-check line. Imani stepped forward, and Gerald flinched. "That's exactly the point, Mr. Whitmore. I shouldn't need a suit and a security detail to be treated with respect. I shouldn't need a title or a press release for you to see me as a human being. You looked at me and saw nothing but my skin color. You decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. I didn't know." Gerald stammered. "I couldn't have known." And that's exactly the problem. Imani's voice was steady, clear, resonant with the authority she had earned through 15 years of climbing over every obstacle the world had thrown in her path. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity. Every passenger who walks through this checkpoint deserves the same respect, regardless of whether they're a CEO or a college student or a grandmother visiting her family." Deputy Director Cole spoke up, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was witnessing. "She's right, Gerald. You treated her like a criminal because of how she looked. Not because of anything she did. Not because of any actual security concern. Just because of your assumptions about what a black woman in jeans must be." Gerald seemed to crumble in on himself. The swagger was gone, the superiority vanished, leaving behind nothing but a middle-aged man who had just realized he had destroyed his own life in a moment of racist arrogance. He turned to Cole, to Victoria, to anyone who might offer a lifeline. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been here 22 years. This job is all I have. My wife, my kids, my pension. Please don't do this." Imani looked at him for a long moment, and something unexpected flickered across her face. Not forgiveness, exactly. But something close to pity. 22 years, she repeated quietly. "And how many people like me have you done this to in 22 years? Gerald opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. "How many black travelers have you humiliated in this checkpoint? How many brown travelers? How many immigrants? How many people who looked different or sounded different or dressed differently than your idea of what an American should be? Imani's voice was rising now, carrying across the checkpoint to the crowd of passengers who had stopped even pretending to continue through security. How many of them didn't have someone to call? How many of them missed their flights because of your suspicions? How many missed job interviews, family emergencies, final goodbyes to dying relatives? Gerald's eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill over. I'm not the first person you've done this to, Imani continued. I'm just the first one who has the power to stop you. A movement in the corner of her eye made Imani turn. Derek Simmons was approaching, his TSA uniform suddenly seeming too tight, his young face aged by the weight of what he was about to do. Ms. Thornton, he said, his voice shaking slightly, I should have said something. I saw what he was doing. I've seen him do it before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds. I was afraid to speak up. Afraid for my job, my family, my future. But that's not an excuse. Fear doesn't justify cowardice. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. I understand fear, Officer Simmons, Imani said gently. I've lived with it my entire life. The fear of being stopped for no reason. The fear of being questioned about where I belong. The fear that one wrong word, one unexpected move, could end with me in handcuffs or worse. Derek nodded, tears streaming openly down his face now. I'll testify. To everything I've seen him do. All of it. Every passenger he's harassed, every document he's questioned, every snide comment and suspicious glare. I have dates, names, incident numbers. I've been keeping records because I knew someday, someone would ask. Gerald stared at Derek with dawning horror. You've been keeping records? On me? Derek met his gaze without flinching. Someone had to. Someone had to make sure there was evidence when this day finally came. Victoria Chen stepped forward, pulling out a business card and pressing it into Derek's hand. Officer Simmons, I'd like you to contact our legal department at your earliest convenience. Your testimony could be valuable not just in this case, but in addressing the broader patterns of discrimination at airports across the country. Cole was on his phone now, speaking rapidly to someone on the other end. Imani caught fragments of the conversation. TSA administrator, yes, sir, confirmed, understood, immediately. When he hung up, his expression was that of a man who had just received orders he was all too happy to follow. Mr. Whitmore, Cole said formally, effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending a full investigation. Your credentials will be confiscated. You will be escorted from this facility. Any attempt to contact Ms. Thornton or any witness to today's events will be considered obstruction of justice. Gerald seemed to deflate completely, his body sagging as if the bones had been removed from his frame. This isn't fair, he whispered. I was just doing my job. I was protecting the country. No, Imani said quietly. You were protecting your prejudices. There's a difference. Two uniformed officers appeared at Gerald's sides, taking his arms with practiced efficiency. As they led him away from the checkpoint, Gerald turned one last time to look at Imani. There was something in his eyes that might have been remorse or might have been resentment. It was impossible to tell, and in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in 22 years, Gerald Whitmore was being held accountable for his actions. As he disappeared through a staff door, the checkpoint erupted in spontaneous applause. It started with one person, then spread like wildfire until hundreds of travelers were clapping and cheering for a woman most of them had never heard of an hour ago. Imani stood in the center of the storm, accepting their support with a gracious nod, but her mind was already moving forward. This was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. The press conference was hastily arranged in a conference room at the airport's administrative wing. Folding chairs had been set up in rows that quickly proved inadequate for the number of reporters who wanted to be present. Camera crews jostled for position along the walls. The buzz of conversation filled the room like static electricity, everyone speculating about what they were about to witness. Imani stood behind a podium that had been set up at the front of the room, flanked by Chairman Theodore Kingston on her right and Senator Patricia Williams on her left. The senator had flown in on a chartered plane the moment she heard what had happened, canceling 3 meetings and a fundraiser to be present. As a member of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, she had a vested interest in airport security practices. As a black woman who had faced her own share of discrimination, she had a personal stake in seeing justice done. Deputy Director Cole stood off to one side, his presence a visible reminder that the TSA was taking this incident seriously. Behind the podium, the logos of Atlantic Airways and TSA were displayed side by side, an unlikely partnership born from an even more unlikely circumstance. Kingston stepped up to the microphone first. He was 73 years old, a white man who had spent 50 years in the aviation industry, and his voice carried the weight of all that experience. Today was supposed to be a day of celebration, he began. We had planned to announce to America that Imani Thornton, a woman who started her career as a baggage handler at Detroit Metro Airport, would become the first black female CEO of a major United States airline. It was going to be a moment of pride for our company, for our industry, and for our nation. He paused, his jaw tightening. Instead, we're here because a TSA officer decided that the color of her skin made her a criminal. He looked at this accomplished, intelligent, extraordinary woman and saw nothing but a stereotype. He destroyed her passport, attacked her dignity, and violated everything our country is supposed to stand for. Kingston stepped aside, and Imani took his place at the microphone. The room fell silent. Every camera, every eye, every breath focused on the woman in the center of the storm. What happened to me this morning, Imani said, her voice steady and clear, happens every day in America. To black travelers. To brown travelers. To Muslim travelers and Asian travelers and anyone who doesn't fit someone's idea of what an American should look like. We are stopped, questioned, searched, and humiliated based on nothing but the prejudices of those who claim to protect us. She paused, letting her words settle over the assembled reporters like a blanket. Mr. Whitmore didn't stop me because I was a threat. He stopped me because I was black. He didn't destroy my passport because it was fraudulent. He destroyed it because he couldn't imagine that a black woman in jeans could be anything other than a criminal. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. Ms. Thornton, what do you want to happen to Officer Whitmore? Imani considered the question carefully before responding. I want accountability. Not just for him, but for a system that allows this to happen. Mr. Whitmore didn't become a racist overnight. He spent 22 years practicing discrimination, and no one stopped him. That's a systemic failure. That's what needs to change. A reporter from Fox News spoke up, his tone slightly challenging. Some would say he was just doing his job. Airport security is important. Don't officers need the latitude to make judgment calls? Imani met his gaze without flinching. Security and racism are not the same thing. Professionalism and prejudice are not the same thing. Mr. Whitmore didn't make a judgment call based on security training or threat assessment. He made a judgment call based on the color of my skin. There's a big difference, and pretending otherwise is exactly how we got to this point. Senator Williams stepped up to the microphone, her presence commanding immediate attention. As a member of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security, I am calling for an immediate investigation into racial profiling within TSA. Ms. Thornton's experience is documented on video for all the world to see. But how many others aren't? How many black and brown Americans are humiliated every day without witnesses, without recordings, without anyone to speak on their behalf? She turned to face the cameras directly. This is not about one bad officer. This is about systemic racism that permeates our security infrastructure. We have confused suspicion of difference with vigilance against threats. We have taught our officers to see certain faces, certain skin colors, certain styles of dress as inherently suspicious. That is not security. That is prejudice dressed in a uniform. Williams turned to Imani with an expression of deep respect. Ms. Thornton, you have inspired millions today. Not by becoming CEO, although that achievement is remarkable. You have inspired people by standing firm in the face of injustice, by refusing to be diminished, by insisting on your dignity even when it was being stripped away. Imani nodded, acknowledging the senator's words. Thank you, Senator Williams. But I don't want to be an inspiration. I want to be the last person this happens to. I want the next black traveler who walks through an airport checkpoint to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. That's not a revolutionary demand. It's the bare minimum of what America should offer its citizens. Deputy Director Cole approached the microphone to deliver the announcement everyone had been waiting for. Effective immediately, Gerald Whitmore has been terminated from his position with the Transportation Security Administration. His security clearance has been revoked, and he is permanently banned from working in federal security services. A murmur of approval rippled through the room, but Cole wasn't finished. Additionally, TSA will be referring this case to the Department of Justice for potential civil rights violations. We are also implementing immediate retraining for all officers nationwide on bias awareness and proper document handling procedures. What happened here today was a failure of our organization, and we intend to make it right. Outside the conference room, Gerald Whitmore was being escorted from the airport by security officers. His badge and credentials had been confiscated. His uniform felt like a costume now, a disguise he had worn for 22 years while playing the role of protector when he was really something much uglier. As he was led past a window overlooking the main terminal, he caught a glimpse of a television screen showing the press conference. Imani's face filled the screen, dignified and powerful, nothing like the woman he had assumed her to be. The cheering at the bottom read, Atlantic Airways CEO speaks out after racist TSA incident. Gerald stopped walking, and the officers on either side of him paused. She's really the CEO, he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. She's really going to run that whole airline. One of the officers, a young black man who had said nothing since they started walking, finally spoke. Yes, sir. And thanks to you, she's going to do it with the whole country watching. You turned a press conference into a movement. They continued walking, and Gerald didn't look back. Behind him, in the conference room, Imani Thornton was announcing a series of initiatives that would change the way airlines and airports treated passengers of color. The Traveler Dignity Fund. Bias training partnerships with civil rights organizations. Oversight cameras at checkpoints. The Raymond Thornton Scholarship for Underrepresented Youth in Aviation. Gerald's career was over. Imani's was just beginning. Gate A1 was buzzing with energy when Imani arrived to board her flight to New York. The State Department had expedited an emergency passport, delivered to her by a courier who looked slightly starstruck when he realized who he was helping. The press conference had lasted nearly 2 hours, and Imani had answered every question with patience and grace. Now, finally, she was ready to complete the journey she had started that morning. The gate agent, a young black woman named Keisha who had been following the story on her phone between boarding announcements, looked up as Imani approached and immediately began to cry. Ms. Thornton, I wanted to say. When I saw that video, I felt like it was happening to me. Like it was happening to all of us. Imani reached out and took Keisha's hand. That's because it was, sweetheart. What happened to me today happens to people who look like us every single day. The only difference is that this time, there were cameras. This time, there were consequences. Keisha nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Welcome aboard, Ms. Thornton. It's an honor to serve you. As Imani walked down the jetway, she was greeted by Rosa Martinez, the lead flight attendant for Atlantic Airways Flight 1001. Rosa had been with the airline for 18 years, starting as a beverage cart attendant and working her way up to her current position. She stood at the aircraft door with tears streaming down her face, making no effort to hide them. Ms. Thornton, on behalf of the entire crew, welcome aboard. We're honored to have you with us today. Imani smiled warmly. Thank you, Rosa. How long have you been with the airline? 18 years, ma'am. I've seen a lot of changes in that time. Good ones and bad ones. But I never thought I'd see the day when someone who looks like me would be sitting in that chair. Imani took Rosa's hands in her own, feeling the calluses from years of hard work, seeing the pride shining through the tears. This is just the beginning, Rosa. For all of us. She made her way through the aircraft, and something unexpected happened. As she passed through business class, a man in an expensive suit stood up and began to clap. Then another. Then another. By the time she reached the main cabin, the entire plane was applauding, passengers rising from their seats to acknowledge the woman who had stood up to injustice and refused to be broken. A little black girl in the window seat near the middle of the plane was standing on her seat, waving frantically. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her hair done up in neat braids with colorful beads at the ends. Her mother sat beside her, making no effort to calm her down, tears streaming down her own face. Imani stopped beside their row. "Well, hello there. What's your name?" The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder. "Destiny. My name is Destiny." Imani felt something catch in her throat. "Destiny. Do you know what that word means?" The girl nodded vigorously. "Mama says it means my future is special." Imani knelt down in the aisle, bringing herself to the girl's eye level. "Your mama is absolutely right. You can be anything you want to be, Destiny. A doctor, a scientist, a pilot, a CEO. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Don't let anyone make you feel small because of how you look or where you come from. The future belongs to you." Destiny threw her arms around Imani's neck, hugging her with the uncomplicated affection of childhood. "You're my hero, Ms. Imani." Imani hugged her back, and for a moment, the entire aircraft seemed to hold its breath. It was a small gesture, a brief embrace between strangers, but it meant everything. It meant that the next generation was watching. It meant that they would remember this day, this woman, this moment when someone refused to accept injustice and changed the world instead. Imani finally took her seat in first class, settling into the leather chair that she had earned through 15 years of dedication and sacrifice. The seat next to her was occupied by a white man in his 70s, distinguished looking in a charcoal suit, with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression. "Excuse me," he said, "but aren't you the woman from the video? The one at the security checkpoint?" Imani nodded. "Yes, that was me." The man extended his hand. "Franklin Wells. I wanted to say something to you, if you'll permit me." Imani shook his hand, curious. "Of course." Franklin took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice trembled slightly. "I'm sorry. You weren't the one who tore my passport." "No. But I've been silent too many times when I should have spoken up. I've seen things like what happened to you and just looked away. Told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself I couldn't change anything. Told myself that getting involved would only make things worse." He paused, gathering himself. "I was wrong. Silence is complicity. I know that now." "Why now?" Imani asked gently. "What changed?" Franklin's eyes grew distant. "My granddaughter. She's 7 years old, and she's half black. Her father is a wonderful man, a doctor, the best thing that ever happened to my daughter. But when I saw that video today, all I could think was, that could be her. In 20 years, that little girl could be standing in an airport while some ignorant man destroys her passport and tells her she doesn't belong in her own country." Tears were flowing freely down his weathered cheeks now. "I can't let that happen. I have to do better. We all have to do better." Imani reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then help me make sure it doesn't happen. Not to your granddaughter. Not to anyone." "How?" "Speak up. Every time you see injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it costs you something. Especially then. That's how we change things. Not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 small acts of courage." Franklin nodded, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief that looked like it had been in his family for generations. "I will. I promise you." I will. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York. Imani looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline emerging through the clouds, a forest of glass and steel that had witnessed so much history. In a few hours, she would add to that history. She would stand before the world and accept the title of CEO, becoming the first black woman to lead a major American airline. But that wasn't what made this day significant. What made it significant was the journey. The torn passport in her pocket, now reassembled as best as could be done, a reminder of where she had been. The little girl named Destiny, whose eyes had shone with possibility. The old man named Franklin, who had promised to be better. The countless people watching from their homes, their offices, their own airport terminals, who had seen what happened and decided that it would not define them. The plane touched down smoothly, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Imani remained seated for a moment, watching the others file past, feeling the weight of the day settle over her like a mantle. She had been humiliated and vindicated, torn down and lifted up, all in the span of a few hours. But she was still standing. She would always be standing. Rosa appeared at her elbow as the last passengers departed. "Miss Thornton. Your car is waiting on the tarmac. The press conference is scheduled to begin in 2 hours." Imani rose from her seat, straightening her simple white blouse, the same one she had put on in her Atlanta apartment a lifetime ago. "Thank you, Rosa. For everything." "No, ma'am. Thank you. For showing us what's possible." The press conference at Atlantic Airways headquarters was unlike anything the company had ever seen. The atrium had been transformed into a sea of cameras, microphones, and expectant faces. Every major news network was represented. International correspondents had flown in from London, Tokyo, Paris. Social media influencers with millions of followers were live streaming to audiences around the world. Imani stood backstage, looking at her reflection in a full-length mirror. She had changed into an elegant black suit, professional and polished, the uniform of corporate America. But around her neck, she wore something that made the communications team nervous and the legal team proud. A necklace made from the torn fragments of her passport, laminated and strung together like a badge of honor. "Are you sure about that?" James Morrison asked, eyeing the unusual accessory. "Some people might see it as provocative." Imani touched the necklace gently. "Good. It should provoke. It should remind everyone who sees it what happened today and why it can never happen again." The doors opened, and she walked out into the blinding lights. The applause was thunderous, a wave of sound that crashed over her and didn't stop for nearly 3 minutes. She stood at the podium and let it wash over her, acknowledging the crowd with gracious nods while cameras clicked and flashed from every direction. When the room finally quieted, Imani began to speak. "I thought about wearing something that hides this morning's scars. A high collar, maybe. A scarf. Something that would let us all pretend that the past 12 hours didn't happen, that I'm just another executive taking another corporate job." She touched the passport necklace. "But then I realized that these scars are part of my story. They're part of all our stories. Every black person in America carries invisible scars from moments exactly like what happened to me today. Moments when someone looked at us and saw a criminal instead of a citizen. Moments when our dignity was stripped away because of assumptions made about the color of our skin." The room was utterly silent, hanging on her every word. 15 years ago, I was loading luggage onto planes at Detroit Metro Airport. My father had just lost his job after 28 years of loyal service. My family had nothing except our pride and our belief that hard work would eventually pay off. I stood on that tarmac in the cold Detroit winter, lifting bags that weighed more than I did, and I dreamed of a day when I would be more than invisible. She paused, letting the memory settle over her. Today, I stand before you as the CEO of one of America's largest airlines. The path between those 2 points was never straight. It was filled with people who looked at me and saw limitations. People who assumed I couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. People who told me I didn't belong in boardrooms or business schools or first-class cabins. Her voice rose, filled with conviction. They were wrong. All of them were wrong. And this morning, a man looked at me and saw a criminal. He saw a faker. He saw someone who didn't belong. He was wrong too. But his assumptions didn't come from nowhere. They came from a system that teaches us to fear difference. To suspect darkness. To trust only what looks familiar. She looked directly into the camera that she knew was broadcasting to millions of viewers worldwide. As CEO of Atlantic Airways, I am committed to changing that. Starting today, this airline will become a model for inclusion, for dignity, for the radical idea that every single passenger deserves respect. She outlined the initiatives she had announced at the airport. The Traveler Dignity Fund. The Bias Training Partnerships. The Oversight Cameras. The Raymond Thornton Scholarship. Each announcement drew applause, but Imani wasn't finished. My father used to say that airplanes are the great equalizers. When we're 30,000 feet in the air, we all breathe the same recycled air. We all experience the same turbulence. We all land together. She smiled, and for the first time all day, the smile reached her eyes. It's time we started treating each other that way on the ground too. The applause that followed lasted even longer than the opening ovation. Imani stood at the podium and accepted it, not for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small by someone else's prejudice. Later, after the reporters had filed their stories and the cameras had been packed away, Imani stood alone in her new office on the 50th floor of Atlantic Airways headquarters. The view was spectacular, a panorama of Manhattan at sunset, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible to be real. She pulled out her phone and read a text message from her mother. "Your daddy is smiling down from heaven, baby. You did it." She typed back with trembling fingers. "We did it, Mama. All of us." From her pocket, she retrieved the one piece of her passport that she hadn't put on her necklace. The photo page, torn but still recognizable. Her face stared back at her, serious and composed, the face of a woman who had survived everything the world had thrown at her. She placed the fragment on her desk, propping it against a lamp where it would be the first thing she saw every morning. "They can tear the document," she whispered to herself, "but they can't tear the person." 1 year later, Imani walked through Checkpoint B at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. A new sign hung above the entrance to Terminal South, gleaming in bronze letters, "The Imani Thornton Terminal." She paused at the exact spot where her passport had been destroyed, now marked by a small plaque that read, "Here, injustice was witnessed. Here, change began." A young TSA officer approached her, her uniform crisp, her smile bright. She couldn't have been more than 22, fresh out of training, eager to make a difference. "Miss Thornton. I just wanted to say thank you. I got this job because of your scholarship program. I'm the first person in my family to work for the federal government." Imani studied the young woman's face, feeling a surge of hope for the future. "What's your name?" "Destiny. Destiny Williams." Imani's breath caught. It couldn't be the same little girl from the plane. This woman was in her early 20s. But then she remembered. The girl's mother. The tears streaming down her face. The unspoken sisterhood of black women who had all experienced versions of the same story. "Are you related to a little girl I met on a plane?" "About 8 years old, braids with colorful beads." Destiny's face lit up. "That's my sister. She talks about you all the time. She says she's going to be a CEO just like you when she grows up." Imani felt tears prick her eyes. "You tell your sister that I'm counting on it. The future belongs to both of you." She continued through the checkpoint, passing through security with nothing more than a smile and a wave from the officers on duty. When she reached the gate for her flight, she turned and looked back at the terminal that bore her name. The shadows of the past were still there. They would always be there. But the light was stronger now. And it was spreading. "So I want to ask you something important. After hearing Imani's story, do you believe one person can truly make a difference in fighting injustice?" Comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to know what this story meant to you. If you know someone who needs to hear this message today, please share this video with them. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories of courage and transformation. And remember, the future belongs to those who refuse to accept injustice. It takes just one person to tear you down. But it only takes one person to lift millions up. Thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this community, and may you walk through every checkpoint in life with your head held high. Imani Thornton's journey teaches us powerful truths that extend far beyond the walls of an airport checkpoint. First and foremost, we learn that dignity is not something that should be earned through titles or status. Every human being deserves respect regardless of their appearance, occupation, or background. Gerald Whitmore's greatest failure was not recognizing Imani as a CEO. His failure was not recognizing her as a fellow human being. Second, this story reminds us that silence in the face of injustice makes us complicit. Derek Simmons watched Gerald mistreat passengers for years before finding the courage to speak up. How many of us have looked away when we witnessed discrimination, telling ourselves it wasn't our problem? Third, we see that true strength comes not from retaliation but from transformation. Imani could have simply destroyed Gerald's career and walked away. Instead, she built programs and initiatives that would protect countless travelers for generations to come. She turned her pain into purpose. Finally, this story teaches us that change is possible when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. Miriam Goldstein recorded the video. Franklin Wells promised to speak up. Destiny Williams pursued a career in service. Each small act of courage creates ripples that can become waves. What injustice have you witnessed that you wish you had spoken against? Comment below and share your story. If this message resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their dignity matters. Thank you for watching, and may you always have the courage to stand for what is right, even when standing alone.